Sir, stop right there. Don't take another step. I live here. I'm going home. We got a call. Suspicious individual. That's you. ID now. Okay, just a second.
Tavarius Reed reached for the handle of the heavy glass entrance to the Federal Plaza, his mind already reviewing the docket for the 9 a.m. evidentiary hearing. He was dressed in a well-tailored blue overcoat, carrying a leather briefcase that held years of judicial experience. Before his fingers could even touch the metal, a dark blue sleeve shot across his field of vision, barring the way. Officer Rowan Ellis stepped into the gap, his boots clicking sharply against the stone as he planted himself directly into Tavarius's path. Ellis didn't check for a badge or ask for identification. He simply looked Tavarius up and down with a smirk that suggested he had already decided everything he needed to know. Whoa there, Chief. Public entrance is around the corner and 3 blocks down, Ellis said, his voice carrying a forced authority that echoed off the glass. He kept his hand firmly on the door frame, his chest puffed out to maximize the space he occupied. Tavarius stopped, maintaining a respectful distance, and looked the officer in the eye. He explained calmly that he worked in the building and was late for a scheduled session. Ellis let out a short, dry laugh, glancing at a fellow officer nearby, as if sharing a joke. He told Tavarius that he'd heard every excuse in the book and that looking the part didn't mean he had an all-access pass to a high-security facility. The air between them grew heavy as Ellis leaned in closer, his shadow falling over Tavarius. He made a disparaging comment about the overcoat, suggesting it was a bit too nice for someone just wandering the streets at this hour. Tavarius remained perfectly still, his voice dropping to a low, steady resonance that usually commanded a courtroom. He asked the officer to simply step aside, so he could go through security and clear his credentials at the desk. Ellis's face hardened at the request. He didn't like the lack of fear in the man's eyes. He told Tavarius that he was the one who gave orders at this door, and that right now his order was for Tavarius to turn around and keep walking before things got complicated. Tavarius didn't move, which only fueled Ellis's irritation. The officer began to lecture him on the importance of the building, claiming that people of his caliber were exactly why security was tightened in the first place. It was a blatant display of profiling, masquerading as vigilance. Every time Tavarius tried to speak, Ellis talked over him, growing louder and more aggressive to assert his dominance in front of the morning commuters. Tavarius realized then that the system wasn't just broken in theory, it was being actively sabotaged at the very threshold by men like Ellis. He adjusted his grip on his briefcase, his gaze locked on the officer, knowing that the glass doors behind Rowan Ellis were the only thing standing between a petty bully and a reckoning he wasn't prepared for.
If you come across this video, like, comment and tell me where you are watching from.
Tavarius reached slowly into the interior pocket of his overcoat, his fingers moving toward the leather wallet that held his federal judicial commission and building pass. He told Officer Rowan Ellis that he had his identification right here and that once he saw it, they could move past this misunderstanding. But Ellis didn't want the situation resolved. He wanted a reason to escalate. The moment Tavarius's hand disappeared into the fabric of his coat, Ellis stepped back and dropped his hand toward his holster, his voice rising to a sharp, panicked bark that drew the eyes of every commuter on the sidewalk. "Hands where I can see them. Don't you move." Ellis yelled, his face contorting with a forced intensity. Tavarius froze, his hand still inside the pocket, his expression remaining flat and remarkably calm. He explained in a level voice that he was merely reaching for his ID as requested, but Ellis wasn't listening. The officer claimed he saw a suspicious bulge and accused Tavarius of reaching for a weapon to justify the sudden aggression. He used the movement as a pretext to close the distance again, this time grabbing Tavarius's wrist through the coat and wrenching it out of the pocket with enough force to nearly tip him off balance. Ellis pushed Tavarius back against the cold glass of the entrance, his forearm pressing into Tavarius's chest. He told him that in this post-9/11 world, people didn't just reach into their coats when a police officer was talking to them unless they were looking for trouble. Tavarius looked directly into Ellis's eyes, noting the lack of professional restraint and the clear intent to humiliate. He told the officer that his ID was now visible in the pocket he had just been forced to abandon, but Ellis refused to look. Instead, the officer claimed that anyone can buy a fake badge and that he wouldn't be fooled by some street-level hustle. The physical pressure increased as Ellis leaned his weight into the man. He told Tavarius that by resisting and making threatening movements, he had just turned a simple trespassing warning into a potential felony stop. Every time Tavarius tried to explain his role as the federal chief magistrate, Ellis would cut him off, telling him to save the fantasy stories for the holding cell. The officer's breath was hot against Tavarius's face as he whispered that he had seen guys like him try to talk their way out of a cage 1,000 times before. He was intentionally ignoring the truth to maintain the narrative of the predator and the prey, completely unaware that his refusal to check the identification was the very thing that would ensure he could never carry a badge again. Officer Rowan Ellis didn't just want to stop Tavarius. He wanted an audience for the takedown. He raised his voice, intentionally projecting toward the morning commuters and court employees streaming toward the main entrance. He started calling out to passersby, gesturing toward Tavarius's blue overcoat and leather briefcase as if they were props in a costume. Ellis told the gathering crowd to take a good look at what entitlement looked like, mocking the idea that a man dressed like Tavarius thought he could just bypass the rules everyone else followed. He laughed loudly, telling a young clerk walking by that Tavarius was claiming to be a high-ranking official just to avoid a simple trespass warning. Tavarius stood in the center of the growing circle, the weight of the officer's forearm still pinning him against the glass. He could feel the eyes of the public on him, some curious, some sympathetic, but many fueled by the officer's narrative of suspicion. Ellis leaned in, his voice dripping with a sneering kind of theatricality. He told Tavarius that a nice coat didn't hide the fact that he was a nobody trying to sneak into a building of this caliber. He questioned where Tavarius had even gotten the money for the briefcase, suggesting it was probably stolen from a real professional. The humiliation was the point. Ellis was using the public's presence to strip Tavarius of his dignity before he even reached the cell. The officer's mockery grew more specific and cruel. He told the crowd that Tavarius had the audacity to lecture him on federal law while standing on the wrong side of a locked door. Ellis joked that Tavarius probably spent his weekends watching legal dramas and now thought he could talk his way into a federal hearing. Every time Tavarius tried to calmly state his name or his title, Ellis would bark a laugh and tell him to shut his mouth before he added impersonating a federal officer to the list of charges. He wanted to make sure everyone watching knew that Tavarius was beneath the building, beneath the law, and certainly beneath the man in the uniform. The atmosphere turned sour as the crowd began to murmur. Tavarius remained silent now, his gaze fixed on a point just past Ellis's shoulder, absorbing the scorn with a terrifyingly disciplined composure. He watched as the officer played to the spectators, thrive on the small-time power of the moment. Ellis told the people watching that he was keeping the building safe from people who didn't know their place. He was so caught up in performance, so busy enjoying the public's attention, that he didn't notice the two senior U.S. Marshals standing at the edge of the crowd, their expressions shifting from curiosity to absolute, bone-chilling recognition. Officer Rowan Ellis didn't like the way Tavarius Reed was looking at him. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't anger. It was a steady, clinical observation that made the officer feel small despite his uniform. To reassert his dominance, Ellis stepped into Tavarius's personal space and slammed a heavy palm against the center of the blue overcoat, shoving the man backward. The force of the push sent Tavarius stumbling back a step, his heels clicking against the stone tiles of the plaza. Ellis followed him, closing the gap instantly, his hand remaining on Tavarius's chest as a physical barrier. He told Tavarius that he had been too polite so far and that the conversation was officially over. Tavarius looked down at the hand pressing into his coat and then back up at Ellis. He didn't raise his voice, but the tone he used carried the weight of a gavel strike. He told the officer that he was currently committing a battery against a federal official and that every second he kept his hand on that coat was another year added to a potential civil rights violation. He warned Ellis that he was crossing a line from a simple misunderstanding into a career-ending felony. Ellis just barked another laugh, his chest heaving with adrenaline. He told Tavarius that he loved it when street lawyers started quoting the Bill of Rights while being tossed out of buildings where they didn't belong. The officer's fingers gripped the fabric of the coat, twisting it slightly. He told Tavarius that his lawyer talk didn't work on the street, and that out here, the only law that mattered was the one wearing the badge. Ellis was convinced that Tavarius was bluffing, a common tactic he had seen from people trying to intimidate their way out of a citation. He mocked the idea of legal consequences, telling Tavarius that he'd be lucky if the only consequence he faced today was a bruised ego. He didn't realize that his refusal to listen to the warning was being documented by the very body camera he had forgotten to turn off earlier that morning. Tavarius made one final attempt to de-escalate, asking Ellis to check the name on the docket for courtroom for B before he went any further. Ellis didn't even blink. He told Tavarius that he wouldn't check a grocery list if it came from him. He then used his body weight to shove Tavarius again, this time toward the heavy gold-framed glass doors of the lobby. He told Tavarius that since he was so eager to see the inside of the building, he was going to get his wish, but he'd be seeing it from the floor of the processing room. The physical barrier had become an escort toward a disaster Ellis was too arrogant to see coming, and Tavarius allowed the momentum to carry him toward the one place where the officer's lie would finally meet the truth. Officer Rowan Ellis gripped Tavarius's upper arm, his fingers digging into the thick wool of the blue overcoat as he wrenched him toward the entrance. He wasn't just moving a suspect, he was parading a trophy. Ellis kicked the gold-framed door open with the toe of his boot, the glass vibrating with the impact, and shoved Tavarius into the expansive lobby. He shouted for the shift lead to look up, announcing that he'd caught a live one who thought he could talk his way past the perimeter. Ellis's face was bright with a self-satisfied grin as he scanned the room, looking for the nods of approval from the other guards stationed at the metal detectors. Tavarius stumbled slightly as he was forced onto the polished floor, but he quickly found his footing, his leather briefcase still gripped firmly in his free hand. He didn't struggle or shout. He simply looked at the security desk with a level of calm that should have been a warning to anyone paying attention. Ellis, however, interpreted the silence as submission. He told the guards at the X-ray machines to clear a lane because he wanted to process this genius right where everyone could see. He mocked Tavarius's posture, telling him to stop acting like he was in a boardroom when he was seconds away from being in a holding cell. The officer's hand never left Tavarius's arm as he dragged him closer to the central security hub. Ellis began a loud, exaggerated play-by-play for the benefit of the staff, describing how Tavarius had threatened him with legal consequences outside. He laughed as he told the desk sergeant that they had a man here who thought a fancy coat and a calm voice made him untouchable. He demanded that Tavarius put his briefcase on the conveyor belt, but before Tavarius could move, Ellis snatched it away himself, tossing it onto the metal surface with a heavy thud. He told the room that he was going to enjoy watching this fake professional realize exactly how much power his badge actually carried. The lobby had gone oddly quiet, but not for the reasons Ellis expected. The guards at the detectors weren't laughing back. They were staring at Tavarius with eyes that had gone wide and pale. Ellis didn't notice the shift in the room's energy. He pushed Tavarius one last time, forcing him toward the stainless steel search table, and told him to turn around and put his hands behind his back. He reached for the handcuffs on his belt, his voice rising in a final triumphant bark, telling Tavarius that his little tour of the building was officially over. He was so focused on the click of the metal cuffs that he didn't see the security chief rising from his chair behind the glass partition, his face a mask of absolute horror. Own adrenaline, his hand white-knuckled around Tavarius's arm as he shoved him toward the center of the room. He didn't notice that the two guards at the X-ray machine had frozen mid-motion, their hands hovering over the conveyor belt. He didn't see the desk sergeant's jaw drop or the way the lead security officer slowly stood up, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. Ellis was too busy performing. He barked out an order for someone to bring over the heavy-duty restraints, claiming he had a persistent loiterer who needed a lesson in federal jurisdiction. "What are you all standing around for?" Ellis snapped, looking around the silent room with growing irritation. He gave Tavarius's arm a sharp jerk, trying to force him into a kneeling position. But the resistance he met wasn't physical. It was the atmospheric weight of a dozen people realizing they were witnessing a career suicide. Ellis demanded again that they handcuff the man, his voice rising in a jagged, desperate pitch. He pointed at Tavarius, telling the senior detail that this nobody had been harassing him at the entrance and making false claims about his identity. He expected backup. He expected the usual camaraderie of the badge. Instead, he got a silence so thick it felt like the air had been sucked out of the building. Tavarius didn't struggle against the officer's grip. He simply stood there, his blue overcoat slightly rumpled, but his dignity completely intact. He looked toward the security station, his eyes meeting those of the shift commander. The shift commander didn't look at Ellis. He looked only at Tavarius, and his hands began to tremble. Ellis, blinded by his own bias and the narrow focus of his rage, took the silence for incompetence. He started to reach for his own cuffs, swearing under his breath about having to do everything himself, when the lead officer finally found his voice. It wasn't a shout of support, it was a panicked, breathless whisper that cut through Ellis's bravado like a knife. "Rowan, let go," the commander said, the words barely audible. Ellis blinked, confused by the lack of aggression in his superior's tone. He told the commander that he had it under control and that he just needed the processing paperwork. But the commander was already moving, rounding the desk with a speed that signaled genuine terror. He didn't move toward Tavarius to assist in the arrest. He moved toward Ellis with his hands raised, pleading for him to release his grip. The realization began to crawl up Ellis's spine as he looked at the faces of his colleagues. No one was looking at the trespasser with suspicion anymore. They were looking at Ellis as if he were a man standing on a landmine, and the click of the handcuffs he was about to use felt like the timer running out. The security chief didn't just walk, he sprinted across the lobby, his heavy belt jingling with a frantic rhythm that signaled a total collapse of order. He reached the center of the floor and shoved Officer Rowan Ellis's arm away from Tavarius with such force that the younger officer stumbled back, nearly tripping over the base of a metal detector. Ellis opened his mouth to protest, his face still flushed a deep angry red, but the words died in his throat when he saw the chief drop his head in a deep, agonizingly respectful nod. "Magistrate Reed, I am so sorry," the chief gasped, his voice cracking with genuine fear. "Please, sir. We were not informed you would be arriving through the side entrance this morning. My deepest apologies for this catastrophic oversight." The blood drained from Ellis's face so quickly it was as if a plug had been pulled. The vibrant red of his rage vanished, replaced by a sickly, ghostly white that made his skin look like parchment. He stood paralyzed, his hand still frozen in midair where he had been reaching for his handcuffs. He looked at the man in the blue overcoat, the man he had shoved, mocked, and threatened, and finally saw the person the chief was addressing. He wasn't a loiterer. He wasn't a nobody in a nice coat. He was the federal chief magistrate, the man whose legal opinions governed the very district Ellis patrolled. Tavarius didn't move. He didn't adjust his coat or smooth his hair. He simply stood with his arms at his sides, his eyes fixed on the chief. He told the chief that the oversight wasn't the entrance he used, but the fact that an officer under his command felt comfortable using physical force and verbal abuse against a citizen without even checking a basic identification card. Ellis tried to speak, a weak, pathetic sound escaping his lips, but the chief spun around and barked at him to shut his mouth. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The other guards watched from their stations, their faces masks of disbelief as they realized they had just witnessed the end of a career in real time. Ellis's knees seemed to buckle slightly. He looked at Tavarius, trying to find a trace of the street lawyer he had been mocking just minutes ago, but all he found was a wall of judicial steel. The power dynamic had flipped so violently that the air in the lobby felt different, colder, sharper, and absolutely final. The chief turned back to Tavarius, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, asking what the magistrate required. Tavarius looked at Ellis, then, at the security cameras mounted on the ceiling. He told the chief that they were going to stay right here in the lobby and resolve this matter immediately before he ever set foot in his chambers. Tavarius didn't move toward the elevators. He stood in the center of the lobby, the cold air from the open door still swirling around the ankles of his blue overcoat. He told the security chief that the lobby would serve as his courtroom for the next 10 minutes. The chief, still breathless and visibly shaken, signaled his team to form a perimeter, creating a wall of silent, stone-faced guards around the small space. Tavarius looked at Officer Rowan Ellis, who was leaning against a stainless steel search table for support, his eyes glazed with the shock of a man who had just watched his entire future evaporate. "Chief, I want that officer's body camera secured immediately," Tavarius said, his voice carrying through the quiet lobby with a terrifying clarity. He told the chief to ensure the footage was uploaded to the federal server before the end of the hour, with a copy sent directly to the district attorney's office. He didn't raise his voice, but the weight of the command made Ellis flinch as if he'd been struck. Ellis tried to stammer out an apology, his voice high and reedy, but Tavarius didn't even look at him. He told the chief that an apology was a civil matter, but what he had witnessed was a criminal violation of the color of law. Tavarius then held out his hand, palm up, toward Ellis. He didn't say a word, but the intent was unmistakable. The security chief stepped forward and barked at Ellis to hand over his badge and his duty weapon. Ellis's fingers fumbled with the leather housing on his belt, his hands shaking so violently that he nearly dropped the metal shield. He placed the badge into the chief's hand, the small piece of tin looking insignificant against the gravity of the moment. Tavarius noted the serial number and told the chief that this officer was to be escorted from the building immediately and placed on unpaid administrative leave pending a formal civil rights inquiry. The lobby was a scene of absolute clinical dismantling. Tavarius pointed to the briefcase that Ellis had tossed onto the conveyor belt earlier and asked the chief to retrieve it with the care a piece of evidence deserved. He explained that the briefcase contained protected judicial documents that Ellis had attempted to seize without a warrant or probable cause. Every word Tavarius spoke was a recorded nail in the coffin of Ellis's career. The officer stood there, stripped of his authority and his pride, realizing that the lawyer talk he had mocked was actually the precise legal terminology of his own professional execution. Tavarius watched as the chief took Ellis by the arm, the same way Ellis had grabbed Tavarius, and led him toward the back exit, away from the public eye he had so desperately tried to impress. Tavarius stepped into the quiet of his courtroom just as the clock on the back wall clicked toward 9. The heavy double doors settled into place behind him, cutting off the lingering tension of the lobby. He didn't head for his chambers to decompress. He walked straight to the bench, his blue overcoat still draped over his arm. The court clerk and the court reporter looked up, surprised to see the magistrate entering from the public gallery side rather than the private door. Tavarius laid his leather briefcase on the table and looked at the clerk. He told her to call the morning calendar, but to keep the record open for a special preliminary statement. He took his seat at the bench, not with the distant, clinical air of a man insulated by high office, but with a sharp, renewed focus that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. He told the assembled attorneys and the small group in the gallery that the law did not exist in the vacuum of a courtroom. He explained that he had just spent 20 minutes being physically barred from his own building by an officer who believed the uniform was a license to profile and harass. The room was deathly still as Tavarius stated that if the chief magistrate could be pushed against glass and threatened for simply walking to work, then the citizens they served had no hope of justice unless the system changed at the very root. While Tavarius began the day's first hearing, Rowan Ellis was being marched through the basement service corridor of the plaza. The security chief didn't offer him a seat or a chance to explain. He led him directly to a windowless intake room where 2 internal affairs investigators were already waiting. Ellis sat on a plastic chair, his uniform shirt missing the badge he had worn for 5 years, looking at the floor as the investigators played back his own body camera footage. The mockery, the physical shove, and the refusal to check Tavarius's identification were all there in high definition. Ellis tried to speak, to claim he was just following standard procedure, but the lead investigator cut him off. He told Ellis that his procedure had just created a federal liability that would take years to settle. Back in courtroom 4B, Tavarius listened to a routine motion with an intensity that the attorneys hadn't seen in months. The experience at the door had stripped away his detachment. He realized he had become too comfortable behind the bench, forgetting the friction and fear that regular people faced before they ever reached his presence. He announced at the conclusion of the first case that he would be drafting a formal memorandum to the Marshal Service and the local police department regarding front-end accountability. He told the court that from this day forward, any evidence brought before him that involved a similar lack of probable cause or basic human respect would be scrutinized with the same hand that had just taken a badge in the lobby. Tavarius Reed had arrived at work as a judge, but he was leaving the morning as a reformer, knowing that the real seat of power wasn't the bench he sat on, but the rights he protected at the door. If you believe that federal agents must be held to the same laws they enforce, and that civil rights apply to everyone regardless of their position, subscribe and turn on notifications tomorrow. We're bringing another story that proves documentation and courage can bring down even the most powerful people who think they're untouchable.